Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, the UN warns that the storm that's devastated parts of Mozambique, Malawi and Zimbabwe may be the worst ever weather disaster the Southern Hemisphere has ever seen. 5 days after Cyclone Idai touches down and rescuers are still struggling to get to remote areas. Also, South Africa says it doesn't know when rolling power cuts will end. Despite being one of the continent's strongest economies, it's been plunged into the dark because of the state energy company's debts. And Moscow backs Algiers, even as protests against President Abdelaziz Bouteflika continue in the North African country. Algeria's deputy prime minister heads to Moscow to drum up more support from its traditional ally. But first, as emergency responders struggle to deal with the devastating aftermath of Cyclone Idai, authorities in Mozambique and aid organisations fear that the world is failing to grasp the severity of the crisis caused in southern Africa by last week's extreme weather. At least 1,000 people have been killed in Mozambique, and that number is set to rise if people still clinging to hope are swept away by rising waters or not reached in time with food, water and medicine.
The storm may have passed, but the disaster is still unfolding. Flash floods continue to hamper rescue efforts in Beira, home to over 500,000 people, as well as the surrounding area. Up to 1,000 people may have died.
Speaking to colleagues on the ground, I think there's a view now that this is probably the worst humanitarian catastrophe to hit Mozambique in probably 20 years. Our team that arrived on Sunday found Beira, that had been a city that had been completely devastated, 90% of buildings severely damaged.
Winds of up to 194 kilometres per hour hit the port city when Idai made landfall last week. The storm caused flooding of up to 6 metres, creating an inland ocean. Roads were swallowed up into sinkholes and entire homes were washed away. Rescue workers have been trying to reach survivors who may be stranded on treetops and roofs. The flooding means sanitary conditions are poor. There could be risk of an outbreak of diseases.
For the immediate need, WHO is positioning health kits, emergency health kits, trauma kits, and also cholera kits in order to be able to assist people on the ground as soon as these kits get there.
Idai then moved on to cause landslides and heavy rains in neighbouring Malawi and Zimbabwe, where hundreds are missing. The UN said it was mobilising aid for 600,000 people, and China also pledged on Tuesday to provide aid relief to all 3 countries. Heavy rains are expected to continue, and the risk of further flooding is high.
Well, 4 days after Tropical Cyclone Idai made landfall, and torrential rains are expected to continue in Mozambique until at least Thursday. Authorities are rushing to try and get aid through whilst keeping up the pace of rescues. Helicopters have had to be drafted in, as many of those still stranded cannot be reached by land.
For the official statistics, they are like it's 84 persons who've died, but we know for sure because of access. Due to maybe infrastructure breakdown, we have no access to road, and also it's raining very hard and the rivers have burst, also affecting areas like Buzi. And so there are other places that you cannot account for, or people have not yet, or rescuers have not reached. So we don't have that information from the people. And yes, we expect this death toll to rise.
Well, Malawi and Zimbabwe were also hit by the cyclonic winds and floods. The UN reckons that about 2.6 million people have been affected across southeastern Africa. On Tuesday, Zimbabwe's leader, Emmerson Mnangagwa, visited Chimanimani, one of the worst-hit areas in his country. He said that several nations in the region have offered assistance. At least 100 people are thought to have died so far in Zimbabwe because of the storm. Malawi's so far confirmed about 56 deaths. Now, South Africa has suffered almost a week of blackouts, and state power company Eskom says that the load shedding will continue on Wednesday. Swathes of the nation have been plunged into darkness as the utility giant keeps up the highly unpopular power rationing. The company is plagued by huge debts, and power supply has been made even more fragile by the cyclone that struck the region last week. Jane Flanagan tells us more.
I'm sitting here in the dark talking to you, Georgia, because we are on load shedding in Cape Town this evening. Well, we're suffering because of very poorly maintained infrastructure. The power stations in South Africa are very old. The average age is 37, which is old if you're a power station, and they haven't been well looked after by the ANC government and the white minority government before that. We're also, as you mentioned, badly affected by the cyclone that hit Mozambique, because South Africa imports electricity from Mozambique. So for that reason, they have had to cut power to businesses and households in South Africa. Otherwise, there is a risk that the national grid would collapse. There is simply not enough electricity to meet the demand. And we're only in autumn, we're not in winter. So it makes us wonder how we're going to cope when people really are going to put pressure on the power system in the months to come.
Well, hopefully some kind of resolution will be found before then. Is there an end in sight at all?
No, I'm afraid not. We heard from Pravin Gordhan, who is the minister in charge of state-owned enterprises, which includes Eskom, the power utility. And today he couldn't tell South Africans when there is going to be any end in sight for these power outages. We are led to believe to expect them on and off for indefinitely, actually. We're now on day 6 of the highest level of load shedding. That means we are without power twice a day for at least 2.5 hours per time. The cost to the South African economy is said to be $140 million a day. That is something that the sluggish South African economy can ill afford, and it is not only costing businesses dearly, of course, it really does grind people down to go without power for large parts of the day.
Jane Flanagan there speaking to me a little earlier on. Now, Moscow's backed Algiers even as protests against President Abdelaziz Bouteflika continued in the North African country. As popular unrest over his 2 decades of leadership continue, his traditional allies come more in handy than ever. Algeria's deputy prime minister was in Moscow on Tuesday to try and drum up more support. Nicolas Chemin tells us more.
As the anti-Bouteflika protests continued in Algeria, the government is seeking support from its historical allies like Russia. Deputy Prime Minister Ramtam Lamamra went to Moscow and repeated Bouteflika's pledge once again.
Abdelaziz Bouteflika took the decision not to take part in this election, and he is entirely ready to transfer his powers in an open and transparent manner to the president who will be chosen in the next election.
But no date has been given for this election. Russia's foreign minister said the international community should not meddle in Algeria's affairs.
Some observers talk about a similarity between what's happening in Algeria and the Arab Spring. I think they're referring to the attempts to destabilize a country from the outside, because the beautiful expression Arab Spring in fact turned out to be a very rude interference in domestic affairs of sovereign countries, whether it was in Libya or Syria.
Algeria and Russia have had a strong relationship for decades, especially after the North African country's independence in 1962 when it embraced socialism. Moscow regularly sells weapons to Algiers. After Russia, Ramtam Lamamra will go to several European countries and China. Beijing has, for years, invested billions of euros in Algeria.
And Yaoundé's less than keen to take up an offer for negotiations from a jailed opposition leader. Maurice Kamto was detained with hundreds of his supporters in January after he held demonstrations insisting that he'd won last year's presidential election and not current leader Paul Biya. Indira Eteng tells us more.
In an outing early Tuesday, the Minister of Communication in Cameroon stated that Maurice Kamto is a citizen like every other Cameroonian and will not be given any special kind of treatment. He went on to rubbish suggestions that Maurice Kamto may be meeting with President Paul Biya in the days ahead to talk out their differences. He also did not fail to underline the fact that Maurice Kamto is not a political prisoner, but is being detained for infringing on the rights of Cameroonians by protesting. Now, over the weekend, the French lawyer of Maurice Kamto, that is Dupont-Moretti, granted a press conference where he stated that his client is ready and willing to meet with Biya to sort out their differences. He, however, stated that he still cannot fully understand the charges leveled against his client by the Yaoundé Military Tribunal. Now, it should be noted that the outing of the government spokesman in Cameroon comes just hours after the visiting U.S. Assistant Secretary for African Affairs visited President Biya. He also expressed concerns about the arrest and detention of Maurice Kamto, urging the government of Cameroon to exercise due process to allow for freedom of expression in the country. Maurice Kamto, alongside about 200 members of his Cameroon Renaissance Movement party, were arrested on the 28th of January after staging protests in several parts of the country.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks very much for joining us, and do so again if you can. Take care.
In 2002, the Boston Globe published a bombshell investigation. The US Daily revealed that 5 priests from the area had repeatedly raped young parishioners. Victims started speaking out and realizing they were alone in their fate. The scandal, local at first, resonated across the world.
It sounds ignorant, but you really think you're the only one, and that blew my mind. That the church did this over and over again to all of us.
25 years on, many of the victims say they're still suffering, and that the resignation of a cardinal or endless trials have not healed their wounds.
We revisit Boston Catholic's church paedophile crisis, all this week on France 24.